The first scream came from the second floor, sharp enough to cut through the music. The clink of glasses, the hum of expensive donors pretending not to stare at each other's watches. Then the smoke alarm began to shriek. Then somebody yelled, "Fire!" And the entire fundraiser at St. Catherine Memorial fractured in a single violent second. Trays crashed to the marble floor. A champagne flute burst under someone's heel. Lydia Mercer did not look toward the ballroom doors with everyone else. She looked up, straight at the ceiling, as if she could see through the plaster into the pediatric wing above them. And for one stunned beat, her body refused to accept what her mind already knew. Her son was upstairs. "No," she said, though nobody had asked her anything. Then she was moving. Her heels slipped on the polished floor, her black dress snagging at the knee as she shoved past a city councilman and a hospital donor's wife who smelled like gardenia and panic. Heat was already spreading through the atrium, dry and ugly, carrying the bitter electrical stink of burning plastic. A security guard caught her elbow near the staircase. "Ma'am, you can't go up there." Lydia tore free so hard she nearly fell. "My son is on 7. The elevators are shut down." "Then move." Her voice came out low, not hysterical, which scared the guard more than shouting would have. He stepped aside on instinct. Around her, the hospital was changing shape. A gala 1 second, a disaster zone the next. Staff in formal clothes ripped off jackets and name badges and became clinicians again. Nurses sprinted toward supply closets. Doctors barked triage orders with half-tied bow ties hanging crooked at their throats. Somewhere, glass exploded. Somewhere a child was crying in a thin, animal sound. Lydia hit the stairwell door shoulder first and pushed into air thick with smoke and old paint and trapped heat. The emergency lights painted the concrete walls in a weak red pulse. Her lungs clenched at the first breath. She grabbed the railing and climbed. On the third landing, she almost collided with a man coming down carrying an oxygen tank against his chest. He was soot-streaked, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's department sport coat over a dress shirt gone dark with sweat. He caught himself, caught the tank, then caught sight of her face. "Lydia?" She stopped as if struck. Ben Holloway looked older than he had 6 months ago at the courthouse, the last time they'd spoken without lawyers nearby. Lines cut deeper around his mouth. His hair at the temples had gone more gray than brown, but his eyes were the same steady blue, and right now they widened with something too complicated to name. Alarm, recognition, regret. "Eli's upstairs," she said. "I know." Ben shifted the oxygen tank to one arm. "I was just on 5. They're evacuating 7 through the west stairwell." "Then why is there smoke in here?" "Because the fire doors on 6 didn't seal." A crackle sounded overhead. Something heavy slammed in a distant corridor. Ben looked up, calculated, then looked back at her with the expression of a man about to make a choice he already hated. "You need to go back down." Lydia gave him a dead stare. "I'm not doing this with you. This isn't about us. Everything is about us when my son is trapped in your county hospital because your inspectors signed off on a faulty renovation." Ben's jaw tightened. "Not now. Especially now." She started past him. He caught her wrist, not hard, but hard enough. The contact shot both of them backward in time against their will, to court hallways, to whispered arguments in parking lots, to the ICU waiting room 3 years earlier, when Eli was first diagnosed, and Ben had stood beside her for 19 straight hours before learning how easy it was to love someone and still fail them. Lydia yanked her hand free. "Don't touch me, unless you're helping me get to him." Ben held her gaze for 1 beat, then nodded once. "Fine. Stay behind me." They climbed together. By the 6th floor, the smoke thickened into a low, dirty cloud hugging the ceiling. The corridor beyond the stair door was dim, flickering, lined with framed donor portraits and promotional banners for the children's cancer wing, all of it grotesquely ordinary under emergency lights. A sprinkler had gone off somewhere nearby. Water sheeted across part of the hall, carrying ash in gray swirls toward a drain. Lydia could hear the hospital breathing wrong now. Ventilators chirping, alarms layering over alarms, voices ricocheting through the corridor in clipped commands. She tasted metal on her tongue. "What happened?" she asked as they crouched low and moved forward. "Preliminary guess?" Ben said. "Electrical fault in the temporary imaging suite." "Temporary, of course, Lydia." "No, say it. Temporary, because the board pushed construction through before code review was finished." Her voice sharpened with every word. "Because the county needed the ribbon cutting before election season. Because everybody wanted pictures." Ben stopped by a crash cart parked sideways near the nurse's station and turned toward her. The red light washed his face into angles. "You think I don't know that? Do you? I fought that expansion for 4 months. And then you backed down." A nurse burst out of room 612, pushing an elderly patient in a wheelchair. followed by an aide dragging 2 IV poles, and the moment snapped. Ben stepped aside to let them through. Lydia saw his expression in profile, a brief flinch, the kind a body makes when it's hit where an old bruise lives. They kept moving. The pediatric wing entrance stood open ahead, cheerful painted murals of whales and stars warped by smoke. A stuffed giraffe lay on the floor outside reception, one glass eye reflecting emergency light. Lydia's chest caved inward. Eli hated that giraffe. He said it watched him sleep when he was admitted overnight for chemo. She'd promised to hide it in the closet next time. In the unit, the air was hotter. Nurses in blue scrubs and surgical masks moved bed to bed with the terrifying efficiency of people who had done drills for the possibility of disaster and still never believed it would come. A resident with mascara streaked under her eyes was squeezing an ombu bag for a little girl on a gurney while shouting for transport. A father in a suit jacket and hospital socks kept repeating, "Where is my daughter? Where is my daughter?" as if enough repetitions might force the answer into existence. Lydia scanned room numbers. 701, 703, 705. Empty. Bed stripped. Room 707 still occupied. Her heartbeat slammed against her ribs. She pushed inside. Eli was awake, small against the white sheets, an IV taped to his hand, his face pale under the freckles he'd gotten from Ben. He looked 11 and 80 at the same time. "Mom?" His voice was hoarse. "Hey, baby." She crossed the room so fast she almost knocked over the pump. She bent over him, hands on his cheeks, breathing him in through smoke and antiseptic, and the sweet medicinal smell that clung to all oncology floors. "We're leaving." Eli blinked past her. "Dad?" Ben entered behind her with a folded evacuation chair. For a second, the three of them froze in a shape that used to be a family. Eli tried to sit up too quickly, and winced. "I thought I heard you." Ben's whole face changed when he looked at his son. Some men softened. Ben Holloway seemed to cave inward around tenderness, as if it exposed a structural weakness nobody else was allowed to see. "You heard me, because I'm here," he said. "And we're getting you out." Eli swallowed. "Is it bad?" Lydia tucked the hospital blanket tighter around him, because she needed something to do with her hands. "It's messy, not bad." Eli gave her the faintest look, old enough now to recognize a lie on contact. "Mom." Ben slid the evacuation chair open at the bedside. "It's serious enough that we need to move fast." He kept his tone level. Law enforcement voice. Disaster voice. The voice Lydia used to hate because it sounded so calm, it made her feel abandoned, until she learned that calm was how he held terror without letting it spill. Eli watched him. "Are people dead?" Silence expanded. Outside, someone shouted for respiratory backup. Water hissed in the corridor. Lydia felt her throat close. Ben answered first. "I don't know yet." That honesty, blunt and measured, had always been the cruelest and most merciful thing about him. Eli nodded once, as if filing the information where it belonged. "Can I walk?" "You're dizzy," Lydia said, "and your counts are low." "I'm not a baby." "Nobody said you were." But when Ben and Lydia helped him up, Eli's knees buckled almost immediately. Ben caught him under the arms while Lydia steadied the IV. The boy's face went white with pain and humiliation. "Chair," Lydia said softly. Eli shook his head. "No." "Eli," Ben said, crouching so they were eye level. "Listen to me. This is not losing. This is logistics." For the first time, Eli laughed, just a quick breath through his nose. "That's such a dad thing to say." "Good. Then be smart enough to obey it." They got him secured into the chair. Lydia ripped off the floral corsage from her own wrist and used the ribbon to tie his blanket around his shoulders because the hall was cold where the sprinklers had run. She noticed her hands were shaking only when Eli put his smaller one over hers. "I'm okay," he whispered, and she almost broke right there because children should never have to comfort their parents in hospitals. The corridor outside had worsened. Smoke rolled lower now, flattening visibility. The fire suppression system had left puddles across the floor, reflecting flashing reds and whites like broken sirens. At the far end of the hall, two administrators in dinner clothes were arguing with a charge nurse over which records room needed to be secured first. Lydia caught one of them by the lapel as they passed. "My son nearly burned alive, and you're protecting paperwork?" the man stammered, face gone papery beneath his tan. Ben stepped between them before Lydia could do something irreversible. "Move," he told the administrator, in a tone that made obedience sound like survival. The man moved. They headed toward the west stairwell, Ben controlling the chair backward, Lydia holding the IV pole high and keeping Eli's head tucked low. Halfway there, a woman in blood-specked scrubs stumbled out of an exam room carrying a bundled infant and looking half-blind from smoke. "Can somebody take him?" she shouted. I've got 2 more in there. Ben looked at the stairwell, then at the room, then at Lydia. It was not even a conversation. It was arithmetic with human cost. Lydia saw it happen in his eyes. Son, stranger, time, fire, structure, duty. The old fault line in their marriage cracked open beneath them. He had chosen strangers before. She had never forgiven him for believing that was nobility instead of betrayal. Don't, she said. Ben's face hardened with pain. Lydia, don't you dare. The nurse's arms trembled around the infant. Eli, white-faced in the chair, looked from one parent to the other and understood far too much. Ben said, I can hand off Eli at the stairs and come back. No. Lydia heard the word leave her like a gunshot. No, you do not leave us again in a hospital hallway. Not for a minute. Not for anybody. The nurse made a sound halfway between a sob and a curse. Ben stood motionless, his whole body pulled between competing oaths. Then Eli spoke, voice thin but steady. Dad. Ben looked at him. Go help her. Lydia turned in disbelief. Eli's eyes filled, but he did not look away from his father. If you don't, you'll hate yourself, and then Mom will hate you more, and then we'll all still be us. For one surreal second, even the alarms seemed to recede before the raw intelligence of a sick 11-year-old, naming the family disease better than any therapist ever had. Ben's mouth opened, shut. Lydia felt something sharp twist under her ribs, not just fear now but shame, because Eli had inherited both her ferocity and Ben's moral reflex, and neither inheritance had made his life easier. Ben transferred the chair handles into Lydia's grip. Stairwell is 30 feet. Keep low. Deputy Morales is posted there. Tell him I sent you. Lydia wanted to say no again, wanted to command the universe back into one shape she could survive. Instead, she nodded once, furious tears burning her eyes. Ben squeezed Eli's shoulder. I'm coming back. Then he disappeared into the smoke with the nurse. Lydia pushed the chair. Every wheel squeal sounded too loud. The corridor seemed to lengthen in front of her like a nightmare trick. Eli coughed once, twice, then harder. She bent low over him, shielding his face with the edge of her dress, tasting ash. At the stairwell door, a deputy in formal uniform pants and a rolled-up white shirt took one look at Ben's son and pulled the door open. Cool concrete air hit Lydia's face like another world. Below them, evacuation traffic jammed the stairs. Patients, staff, wheelchairs, portable oxygen, a man carrying a teenage girl in his arms, a nurse reciting medication dosages to herself, as if memory alone could keep people alive. Lydia started down, step by brutal step, the chair bumping and clattering. Eli gripping the sides hard enough to whiten his knuckles. Behind them, above them, the hospital groaned. Then came a muffled boom from somewhere up the west corridor, deep enough to vibrate through concrete, followed by a burst of screams. Lydia stopped dead on the landing, one hand flying to the wall. Eli's face drained of all color. They both looked up. Smoke poured under the stairwell door in a dark ribbon. Nobody spoke. Nobody had to. Ben was still up there. Lydia's body moved before her mind did. She shoved the chair hard enough to jolt Eli forward a fraction, then caught the back handles and steadied him with an apology that never made it past her teeth. People below were still descending, muttering, crying, dragging themselves downward in the rhythm of emergency, but all she could hear was the aftersound of the blast and the pulse in her ears. Mom, Eli said, not loudly, but in the exact tone he used when he knew she had left the room emotionally, even if she was still standing in front of him. She looked down at him. His eyes were red from smoke, lashes wet, face too sharp in the stairwell light. He knew. Not what had happened exactly, but enough. The possibility had entered him. Ben could be hurt. Ben could be dead. Lydia pressed one hand briefly to Eli's shoulder, grounding herself against bone and blanket, and the stubborn fact that one part of her life still required motion. We keep moving, she said. Her voice was rough and wrong. The deputy below them started climbing toward the door, with 2 firefighters pushing past him, their air tanks scraping the walls. Ma'am, keep going down, he shouted. They've got it. Lydia almost laughed at the phrase. They've got it, as if anything had ever really been held. As if the whole architecture of their lives had not been one sequence of dropped things, disguised as necessary sacrifices. She forced the chair downward. Each landing smelled different. On one, concrete dust and smoke. On the next, the sourness of fear sweat and spilled medication. Lower still, an odor of wet wool, overheated wires, and the faint copper note that might have been blood or might have been her imagination primed for catastrophe. Eli coughed into the blanket. Lydia bent and asked, Can you breathe? Enough. That is not an answer. Then no, not normal. He gave a weak attempt at a smile. trying to manage her the way children of fractured houses learned to do. She hated the competence in it. By the fourth-floor landing, traffic thickened into a bottleneck. 2 nurses were trying to angle a bariatric patient down with an evacuation sled, while a respiratory therapist clutched a portable monitor against his chest and kept asking where the backup batteries were. A woman in a sequined green dress had lost one shoe and both illusions. She clung to the railing and cried without sound. Mascara stripped down her cheeks. Lydia wedged Eli's chair against the wall to give the sled room. The patient moaned with every bump. The nurse at the front was maybe 26, sweat soaking her collar, hands shaking visibly. "On 3, she said to her partner. 1, 2. The sled slipped. Lydia let go of Eli's handle without thinking and lunged, shoulder braced against the stair rail, palm catching vinyl before the patient's weight could swing sideways. Pain shot up her wrist. The young nurse looked at her with stunned gratitude and no time to say any of it. Together they righted the sled. "Go," Lydia said. The nurse nodded and kept moving. Eli watched all of it in silence. Then, when Lydia reclaimed the chair handles, he said, "You would have been mad if Dad did that." She stared at the back of his head. The accusation wasn't mean. It was worse than mean. It was accurate. "Probably," she said. "That doesn't make it wrong." "I know." He paused, breath rattling slightly. "I'm just trying to keep up with the rules." The sentence went into her like glass. She had spent years telling herself the marriage broke because Ben had a savior complex, because public duty always outranked private tenderness with him, because he was never fully in the room unless the room was on fire. But there had been rules on her side too, crueler because she called them boundaries and made them sound healthy. If he chose work over family, he was selfish. If he chose family over work, she distrusted the motive. If he stayed calm, he was cold. If he showed fear, she lost respect for him. Somewhere inside all that logic, there had been a raw, humiliating truth she rarely let herself touch. She had wanted to be chosen in a way no decent man with a badge and a conscience could ever choose. Fully. Repeatedly. At the expense of strangers. At the expense of the world. The stairwell doors on the second floor burst open, and a flood of cooler air brushed their faces, carrying the unmistakable smell of rain from outside and diesel from the fire engines now crowding the ambulance bay. The lower lobby was controlled chaos. Security staff herded evacuees toward the east exit. Volunteers tore tablecloths off gala tables and spread them over gurneys on the floor. The expensive floral centerpieces had been kicked against a wall, roses and hydrangeas shedding petals into puddles. Somewhere a pianist's toppled bench lay on its side beside a tray of untouched crab cakes. The surreal collision of charity and catastrophe made Lydia feel briefly dislocated, as if she had stepped into a theater after the audience fled and discovered the set still believed in itself. "Mercer," someone shouted. She turned. Doctor, Nadia Shah, Eli's attending oncologist, strode toward them with soot on her cheek and an N95 hanging loose around her neck. Her dark hair had come half out of its clip. She looked furious, which Lydia found reassuring. Nadia was never more competent than when she was one moral offense away from homicide. "He needs clean air and a sat check now," Nadia said, dropping to Eli's level before Lydia could answer. "Any increased wheeze? Chest pain?" "No chest pain," Eli said. "Breathing sucks. Language. That wasn't a bad word in context." Nadia slid the pulse oximeter onto his finger. The tiny screen blinked. Lydia watched the numbers as if willing could change physiology. 92, Nadia muttered. "Better than I feared. Worse than I like." She looked up at Lydia. "We're setting temporary triage outside under the east canopy. Get him there. Do not let him walk. Do not let him get chilled." Her gaze flicked behind Lydia, instinctively searching for the missing parent. "Where's Ben?" Lydia opened her mouth. Nothing came. Eli answered for her. He went back for a baby. Nadia's expression changed just enough to show she understood too much history in too few words. "Of course he did," she said softly. And then, because sentiment was a luxury she did not indulge for long, she stood. "I need to go back in." Lydia grabbed her wrist. "No." Nadia looked down at Lydia's hand, then into Lydia's face. "There are 6 children from the post-op wing not yet accounted for. You could die." "Yes." Nadia said it without drama, as an item in a list. "So could they." Lydia released her. Nadia squeezed her shoulder once, hard. "Get Eli outside. Breathe before you decide anything stupid." Then she was gone into the crush of bodies moving the wrong direction for survival. Outside, rain had begun in earnest. A hard spring rain blown sideways by wind, turning the ambulance bay into a slick field of reflected red and blue. Fire engines lined the curb, hoses writhing across the pavement like living things. Portable floodlights blasted the hospital facade in harsh white. Smoke pushed from 2 upper-floor windows, dirty against the night sky. A crowd of evacuees huddled under blankets and foil wraps, faces lit by emergency strobes into masks of shock. Reporters were already gathering behind police tape, umbrellas up, microphones out, the appetite of the public assembling itself in real time. Lydia hated them on sight for arriving so quickly, hated herself for knowing they always did. She got Eli under the east canopy, where folding tables had become triage stations. Medics moved with rapid, practiced imprecision, because mass casualty medicine was the art of never having enough and doing math with lives anyway. A young paramedic took Eli's vitals, while another hung a fresh bag of saline from a temporary pole fashioned out of a coat rack. Lydia stood close enough to touch him every few seconds, as if contact could keep his cells from betraying them further. Rain hammered the metal canopy roof overhead. In the distance, sirens kept arriving, overlapping into one endless mechanical wail. "Mom," Eli said after the paramedics moved on. "Sit down. I'm fine. You're swaying." She hadn't noticed until he said it. The adrenaline that had made her body a tool was draining now, leaving tremor and cold in its place. She sank onto a plastic chair beside him. Her bare legs were streaked with grime. One heel strap had broken completely. Her hands smelled like smoke and hospital sanitizer, and the rubber handle of the evacuation chair. Across the lot, firefighters clustered around the west entrance, conferring in urgent movements and pointing at the upper floors. Somebody was unrolling another hose line. Somebody else was shouting about structural spread. Lydia searched every moving figure for Ben and immediately knew the stupidity of that. He could be anywhere. In the hallway, in a stairwell, in the back of an ambulance, in the part of the night nobody came back from. Her mind tried on each possibility with vicious efficiency. She saw him burned, crushed, suffocating, trying to reach a door whose hinges had warped shut. She saw him conscious and ashamed, unconscious and unreachable, dead beneath fluorescent lights. With each image came a fresh surge of old anger, because even now, even here, terror could not arrive clean. It brought witnesses. It brought history. It brought the cruel memory of the last time she waited outside an operating room, while Ben stood with his hands on his hips, refusing to cry because Eli was only 6 and watching. Afterward, she had called him inhuman in the parking garage, and he had said, with exhausted precision, "No, Lydia, I am human enough to know one of us had to stay upright." She had never forgiven the sentence because it was true, and truth delivered at the wrong moment calcified into insult. Eli shifted in the chair. "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The one where you decide 10 things at once, and none of them are good." Despite herself, she let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "That's a very specific face. I've had a lot of time to study you." Rainwater dripped from the canopy edge in silver chains. A gurney rolled past, carrying a man with an oxygen mask and a burned forearm wrapped in saline gauze. Lydia looked away too late and recognized one of the hospital trustees. His wife followed, shrieking into her phone about liability. Eli watched her expression harden. "You hate all of this," he said. "No." Lydia looked at him. "I hate that you are in it. Same difference. It isn't." He was quiet for a long moment, eyes on the hospital. When he spoke again, his voice had that unsettling steadiness children got only after pain had aged them past their years. "When I was little, I used to think if Dad chose work, it meant he didn't love us enough. Then when I got sick, and he kept showing up, I thought maybe you were wrong about him. Then when he missed stuff again, I thought maybe you were right. But I think maybe you were both using different measuring cups." Lydia felt her whole body go still. "Eli, I'm serious." He picked at the edge of the blanket, not looking at her now. "You measure love by who stays. He measures it by what he can carry. Nobody wins." The words landed with a strange, calm force. Not dramatic, not cruel, just deeply observed. Lydia wanted to tell him he was too young to carry this analysis, too young to understand marriage as a system of incompatible hungers. But children understood whatever adults leaked around them, and she and Ben had leaked for years. She opened her mouth to answer. Then a commotion erupted near the west entrance. A cluster of firefighters surged backward. One dropped to a knee. Another started shouting for medics. Lydia was on her feet before thought could mediate. "Mom!" Eli snapped, panicked now. She gripped the armrest of his chair so hard her knuckles whitened. The scene across the lot sharpened and blurred at once through rain and strobes. 2 firefighters emerged, carrying a limp figure between them, turnout coat hanging open, civilian clothes visible underneath. Broad shoulders, dark pants, one arm swinging loose. Lydia could not breathe. She could not tell if the world had gone silent or if her body had simply cut the sound feed. Then the figure coughed. Even from 40 yards away she saw it, the violent convulsion through the chest. One firefighter nearly lost his hold. The medics ran forward with a stretcher. "Ben," Eli whispered. The name broke the spell. Lydia ran. Water splashed up her calves. Someone yelled at her to stay back. Police tape snagged on her wrist and snapped. By the time she reached the stretcher, Ben was half conscious, soot blackening one side of his face, hair singed at the temple, eyes squeezed shut against coughing. An oxygen mask was pressed over his mouth. Blood ran from a cut along his jaw, diluted pink by rain. A medic tried to block her. "Family only. I am family." The medic took one look at her expression and moved. Ben's eyes opened a sliver. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. Shame was in it first, which infuriated her. Even half drowned in smoke and barely upright, he looked sorry for causing trouble. Lydia bent over him, rain dripping from her hair onto his collar. "Don't you dare," she said. She didn't know what verb came after it. "Die. Apologize. Leave." He made a weak sound beneath the mask. The medic lifted it briefly to assess his airway, and Ben rasped, "Baby?" "Alive," Lydia snapped. "Mad, but alive." His eyelids fluttered. "Infant?" One of the firefighters beside the stretcher answered, "Out and breathing. Nurse, too." Relief crossed Ben's face so nakedly. Lydia had to look away for 1 second, or she would either kiss him or hit him. Maybe both. The medic replaced the mask and started wheeling him toward a second triage line. Lydia moved with them until she heard Eli calling, raw with fear, from under the canopy. She stopped. There it was, the fracture point, sharp and immediate. Her husband being rolled away, needing oxygen, maybe scans, maybe admission. Her son alone in a plastic chair pretending not to unravel. No clean solution. Saving one thing fractured another. She stood in the rain, split clean down the middle by two forms of love that had never learned how to coexist without turning one into debt. Ben saw her stop. Even through the mask and smoke damage, he understood exactly why. He lifted one hand an inch off the stretcher and made the smallest motion toward Eli's side of the lot. "Go." Lydia closed her eyes for one beat, opened them, and backed away. "Don't disappear," she said. Ben's eyes held hers. This time there was no promise in them, only exhausted knowledge of what promises cost. Lydia turned and ran back to her son as the medics took Ben into the flood of lights. And when she reached Eli, she dropped to her knees in the wet pavement and took his face in both hands, breathing like someone who had escaped nothing at all. Lydia's fingers were cold against Eli's cheeks, colder than rain should have made them, and he grabbed her wrists as if he could warm her back into the present by force. "I'm here," he said, though his voice shook on the second word. "I'm here." She nodded too many times. A mechanical jerking motion she could not seem to stop, then rose from the pavement because kneeling made her feel like she had already surrendered to something. The canopy lights hummed overhead. Rain blew in sideways at the edges, turning the concrete slick and shining. Somewhere close by, a generator kicked harder into gear, its vibration traveling through the soles of her feet. Medics kept moving around them in practice diagonals, carrying clipboards, oxygen tanks, thermal blankets, trauma kits. Every face looked simultaneously alert and already depleted, the expression of people spending future strength in advance. Lydia turned to track the stretcher that had taken Ben away, but it had vanished behind a cluster of ambulances and portable privacy screens. She hated how quickly a human being could become a blocked line of sight. "Did you see him breathe?" Eli asked. She looked down. He was trying to sound clinical, like he was gathering evidence rather than pleading. "Yes," she said. "He was conscious." "That doesn't mean okay." "No." Lydia swallowed, tasting the metallic grit that smoke had left along the back of her throat. "It means not gone." "Eli, let that settle." Then he leaned back in the chair, exhausted by hope itself, and closed his eyes for a second too long. Lydia immediately bent toward him. "Hey." His eyes opened. "I know. I'm not passing out. I'm just tired. You don't get to say that so casually. Mom, I have cancer. Fatigue is kind of on brand." Under other conditions, she would have scolded him for the joke. Instead, a broken laugh escaped her, brief and ugly. The paramedic who had checked his oxygen earlier reappeared with a portable nebulizer and a look of narrowed concentration. "Dr. Shah wants this started now," he said. "He's wheezing more." Eli rolled his eyes on reflex, then winced because the movement cost him. The medic fitted the mask over his face, and the machine began its soft mechanical hiss. Lydia stood beside the chair with one hand braced on the backrest and watched the vapor cloud around her son's mouth and nose. It made him look younger, reduced, the kind of child parents still tucked in at bedtime without irony, but his eyes above the mask were older than the night. They tracked the hospital, the crowds, the movement of stretchers with a vigilance no child should acquire. Lydia became suddenly aware of every other child under the canopy. A little boy in Spider-Man pajamas, with an IV still taped to his hand. A teenage girl with a bandaged scalp sitting bolt upright and refusing a blanket because her younger brother had not been located yet. A toddler asleep against a firefighter's turnout coat, tiny fingers knotted in a yellow strap. Disaster had a way of stripping families down to posture and breath and the primitive need to count their living. Nearby, 2 county officials under a golf umbrella were arguing with the fire chief using low, angry voices that carried anyway. Lydia heard words like containment, liability, press statement, and something inside her, already cracked in several places, gave way enough to let fury spread warm through the cold. She straightened, eyes fixed on the officials. Eli saw it instantly and reached out, catching the edge of her hand before she could step away. No. She glanced down. He removed the nebulizer mask long enough to say, "You'll go over there and make sense, and it'll still be stupid, and then you'll get arrested in a cocktail dress. You say that like it's a bad look. On you? Maybe not. On me, yes." He put the mask back on. The absurdity of it anchored her for half a breath. She stayed where she was. Across the lot, reporters were setting up a live stand-up in the rain. A woman with perfect hair despite the weather adjusted her earpiece while the burning hospital rose behind her like a prop. Lydia could already imagine the framing. Tragic fire, courageous responders, questions of oversight, families waiting for answers. By morning, the story would have graphics, packages, and drone footage, and a chyron with the hospital's name reduced to a crisis brand. She had spent enough years adjacent to Ben's office and county politics to know the rhythm. First concern, then blame, then narrative management. The dead, if there were dead, became nouns. The culpable became committees. Somewhere within that machine, people like Ben spent sleepless weeks trying to force actual facts through a structure designed to metabolize them into public comfort. She used to admire that fight in him. Then she came to resent it because the fight never ended, and whatever never ended eventually colonized the home. "You're doing the face again," Eli said through the mask. "Stop noticing everything." "Can't. Genetics." Rain intensified, drumming on the canopy hard enough that everyone had to raise their voices slightly to be heard. A line of evacuees from an assisted living floor emerged through the east doors, escorted by staff with flashlights. Some still carried their purses. One man carried framed photographs tucked under his arm like evidence that he had existed before this night and intended to exist after it. The sight undid Lydia more than flames had. Not the spectacle of danger, but the pathetic dignity of people saving whatever could fit in their hands. She thought of the donor portraits upstairs, the stuffed giraffe in the pediatric corridor, the records administrator guarding paper. Human beings always reached first for symbols, then learned later whether flesh had survived. A medic returned with a dry blanket and draped it over Eli's legs. "You," he told Lydia, "need to get undercover for real." "I am undercover. You're soaked. I've had worse dates." The medic blinked, decided humor and shock was above his pay grade, and moved on. Eli lowered the mask again. "You and Dad both do that." "Do what?" "Make jokes right before you say something awful or true." Lydia almost told him there was no difference. Instead, she tucked the blanket higher over his knees and said, "Breathe the medication." He obeyed, though his gaze drifted past her shoulder. She turned. Nadia Shah was emerging from the hospital with a group of respiratory therapists and one of the pediatric nurses. Her scrubs were darker with water and soot, one sleeve torn near the elbow. She walked with the rigid efficiency of someone refusing to assess her own pain until the numbers improved. Lydia threaded through the clutter toward her. "How many?" she asked before Nadia could speak. Nadia took one look at her face and answered directly. "No pediatric fatalities from the unit. 2 adults unaccounted for in radiology until 5 minutes ago. They're now both located. 1 critical, 1 stable." Lydia realized she had been holding muscles clenched against a blow that, for the moment, had not landed. Relief did not feel clean. It felt like dizziness. "And Ben?" Nadia pushed wet hair off her forehead with the back of one wrist. "Smoke inhalation, probable mild concussion, superficial burns. They're evaluating him in the mobile treatment tent because the ED is swamped." He asked if Eli's SATs were improving before he asked for water. She said it neutrally, but Lydia heard the message under it. Men reveal themselves most plainly in triage. "Can I see him?" Lydia asked. Nadia's eyes flicked toward Eli under the canopy. "You can see one of them at a time, which I suspect is exactly the kind of poetic punishment your life specializes in." Lydia exhaled through her nose. That helpful, huh? I'm a doctor, not a priest. Nadia's attention shifted to a county official approaching with a hospital administrator in tow. Her mouth flattened. The board is already asking how long until they can access executive offices. Lydia stared at her. The building is still smoking. Yes, Nadia said, but paperwork, apparently, is highly flammable to the conscience. Before Lydia could answer, the administrator tried to interject with something about incident protocols. Nadia turned and flayed him alive in 12 measured seconds, citing patient accountability, oxygen failures, and an unresolved maintenance complaint she had filed 3 weeks earlier about the temporary imaging suite. Lydia had never wanted to hug someone and hire a lawyer at the same time, more in her life. While Nadia verbally dismantled them, Lydia's attention snagged on the phrase unresolved maintenance complaint. It sat in her mind like a dropped tool in still water, sending circles outward. 3 weeks? She asked when the administrator retreated. Nadia looked back at her. I sent 2 emails and 1 formal escalation. The circuit breaker in the mobile imaging add-on had tripped twice during load testing. Who knew? Facilities. Administration. Maybe the board. Depends on who read what and who decided reading it counted as doing something. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the low cloud cover, turning the smoke plume briefly silver. Lydia felt the shape of the night change, not because there was suddenly a villain. Catastrophe was almost never neat enough for that, but because neglect had moved from suspicion into detail. An email. A circuit breaker. A choice delayed because some other priority had felt more urgent to people who slept at home tonight. She thought of Ben's face in the stairwell when she accused him of backing down on the expansion. Perhaps he had. Perhaps he had fought and lost. Perhaps losing had required him to keep standing next to people he knew were shaving risk into the walls. The moral geometry of public life was so often just that. 1,000 survivable compromises until one became smoke. Mom. Eli's voice pulled her back. He had taken the mask off again and was watching her, pale and grave. What happened? She looked at Nadia, then at the hospital, then at her son. She wanted to lie. Wanted to give him a version with simple nouns and fewer adult failures, but he had been breathing chemical smoke in a stairwell 30 minutes ago, and talking about incompatible measures of love. Childhood, for the night at least, was closed. I don't know everything yet, she said, but it may not have been an accident people were powerless to prevent. Eli absorbed that with frightening stillness. So someone knew something was wrong, maybe, and still left us in there. Lydia knelt beside him again, this time not because she was collapsing but because truth asked a lower posture. People don't usually think in sentences that evil. They think in smaller ones. It'll probably be fine. We'll handle it next week. We can't delay the opening. There isn't money. There isn't time. Then one day the small sentences add up and look monstrous from the outside. Eli stared at the hospital windows. That's worse. She could not argue. An orderly in a poncho came to tell Lydia that one parent could be admitted into the mobile treatment tent to accompany a minor family member visit in non-critical cases. The phrasing was bureaucratic nonsense, for you may see him now if you move quickly and do not make us regret it. Lydia looked at Eli. Do you want to stay here until Dr. Shaw clears you to move, or come with me to see your father? Eli's answer came immediately. With you. The orderly frowned at the IV pole and blanket arrangement, but Nadia cut in. He can be transported chair and all. I'll sign off. 10 minutes later, Lydia was pushing Eli across the rain-slick lot toward a row of white disaster tents erected near the ambulance dock. The canvas walls snapped in the wind. Portable heaters roared at intervals, fighting the damp. The ground beneath their wheels alternated between rough asphalt and corrugated hose bridges that jolted Eli hard enough to make him grit his teeth. Lydia apologized every time. He stopped answering after the third. At the entrance to the treatment tent, a National Guard medic checked wristbands, then waved them through into a world of bright artificial light and compressed suffering. Cots lined both sides of the tent. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet fabric, smoke residue, and the faint fuel exhaust of the generators outside. Voices were subdued here, not because pain was lesser, but because the tent enforced intimacy. Every moan, every cough, every clipped medical instruction belonged to everyone. Lydia scanned faces until she found Ben on the far side, propped halfway up on a cot with a blood pressure cuff on one arm and a disposable burn dressing along his jaw. His hair was damp where someone had wiped soot from his forehead. An oxygen cannula looped beneath his nose. He looked infuriatingly solid, even injured, as if his body resented vulnerability and was trying to negotiate it down to a procedural inconvenience. When he saw Eli, his expression changed so fast Lydia nearly looked away out of politeness. Love should have privacy, but there was no privacy left anywhere. Eli broke first. You look terrible. Ben huffed what might have been a laugh and immediately coughed for it. That's good. Means your vision's working. Lydia parked the chair beside the cot. For one awkward second, none of them knew the shape of reunion under fluorescent canvas. Then Ben lifted a hand, not toward Lydia, toward Eli. Eli took it at once. His fingers disappeared inside his father's larger, soot-roughened grip. Lydia stood there useless with emotion, feeling like both witness and intruder to a bond she had helped damage and could never fully mediate. Ben's thumb moved once over Eli's knuckles. You breathing better? He asked. A little. Good. He looked at Lydia then, and the whole air around the cot changed. Not romantic. Not reconciled. Just charged with the exhausting density of two people who had once known each other in all seasons and now kept encountering the wreckage of that knowledge in public. You okay? He asked her. It was almost offensive, the question. She was drenched, shaking, barefoot on one side, and standing in a disaster tent while their son's hospital smoked behind them. But she heard what he meant beneath the stupidity of the words. Are you intact enough to keep standing? Are you still in the world with me? Can I stop scanning for where you've cracked? No, she said. You? Also no. Eli made a small exhausted sound between them that might have been amusement or pain. Can you two maybe try being weird later? Ben closed his eyes briefly. Fair. A physician assistant stepped over to review Ben's imaging requisition. Mild inhalation injury. Concussion signs to monitor. No evidence yet of deeper burns. Need observation. Need transport once ED capacity opened. Need rest, hydration, follow-up. Lydia listened to the list and felt how medicine translated terror into management. Around them, the tent kept filling. More cots, more paperwork, more human beings rendered into categories that would determine speed, not worth. At the tent entrance, a sheriff's deputy was speaking urgently to another officer while glancing toward Ben. Then both looked toward Lydia. Something in her spine tightened. Ben saw it too. He released Eli's hand and pushed himself a fraction more upright, wincing. What is it? He asked when the deputy approached. Sheriff, sorry. The deputy lowered his voice, but not enough. County Records wants immediate statements from anyone with prior notice of electrical complaints. And Channel 8 got hold of a maintenance email. They're asking whether the board ignored a fire risk warning. Silence opened under the bright tent lights. Not dramatic this time, not explosive. Worse. Administrative. The kind of silence in which lives turned into testimony. Lydia looked at Nadia's signature on Eli's transport form clipped to the chair handle. She looked at Ben's dressing, at Eli's hollowed face, at the deputy waiting for instructions from a man whose lungs still carried smoke. There it was again. The fracture. The night was not done with them. It was simply changing costumes. Ben rubbed one hand over his mouth, then dropped it. His eyes met Lydia's, and this time neither of them looked away, because both understood the same thing at once. Whatever came next would not be fire, but it could burn down what remained just as thoroughly. Ben's gaze shifted first to Eli, then back to the deputy, then finally settled somewhere in the middle distance, as if he were already trying to assemble three incompatible obligations into a sequence that would not destroy all of them at once. Lydia knew that look better than she knew the layout of her own kitchen. It was the expression he wore when a drunk driving fatality coincided with a county budget hearing, when a deputy-involved shooting landed on the same day Eli spiked a fever, when life demanded the sort of math no one should call leadership because leadership sounded honorable, and this was mostly triage with legal consequences. The deputy waited. Rain rattled faintly on the tent roof above the generators. A woman 2 cots down groaned as a nurse rewrapped her forearm. A monitor somewhere in the rear trilled twice and fell silent again. Ben finally asked, "Who leaked the email?" The deputy glanced at the other officer near the entrance. Unknown. Could be facilities, could be admin, could be one of the board assistants. Media says it came from an internal source. They've got subject line and timestamp, maybe the full body. Lydia watched the information hit him physically. Not surprise. Confirmation. He had expected something like this the moment Nadia mentioned the complaint. His jaw tightened. Who else has seen it? County Council. Interim hospital CEO. Chair of the board. Probably the commissioners by now. The deputy hesitated. And the state fire marshal's office is asking whether prior notice changed the classification from accidental to negligent exposure. Eli looked between the adults with the terrible patience of a child, too used to rooms where the truth arrived in fragments and still somehow rearranged everything. Lydia rested a hand on the back of his chair to stop herself from reaching for him constantly. If she touched him every time fear rose, she would never stop touching him again. Ben's voice came out rough, from smoke, but steady enough to pass for command. No statements in the press without my office, coordinating with the fire marshal. No one from county records, interviews, patients, or medical staff tonight, unless there is an immediate evidentiary issue that can't wait. Anyone with direct knowledge gives formal statements after medical clearance. The deputy nodded, relieved to have instructions that sounded like a bridge over chaos. Yes, sir, Ben added. And tell counsel I'm not discussing liability from a cot, while my lungs still taste like insulation. That got the faintest twitch from Lydia's mouth despite herself. The deputy left. Silence thickened again around the cot. Different this time. The shape of the next several weeks had entered the tent. Investigations, depositions, hearings. Carefully edited public grief. Eli was staring at the plastic ID band around his own wrist, turning it with one finger. Is Dr. Shaw in trouble? He asked. Ben blinked, dragged back from procedure into the smaller, crueler scale that mattered. Why would you ask that? Because she sent the warning. His voice was quiet. And every time grown-ups mess up, the one who says it out loud ends up in trouble too. Lydia closed her eyes for a beat. There was no way to answer that without insulting his intelligence. Ben understood the same thing. He shifted, winced at the pull along his jaw, and said, Sometimes that happens. It shouldn't. But sometimes it does. My job is to make sure facts get where they belong before people start burying them under language. Eli looked up. Will you? It was a simple question in the syntax of a child and a brutal one in every other sense. Lydia saw Ben take the hit, not because Eli doubted him exactly, but because the boy had learned to ask for proof instead of assuming character would carry the day. Ben rubbed his thumb against the blanket over his knees, a small grounding motion Lydia remembered from court waiting rooms and pediatric chemo suites. I'm going to try, he said. That's not the same as promising I can control everyone above me or around me, but I will not help them lie. Eli absorbed that, then nodded once. Lydia knew why the answer hurt, and why it was the only one worth hearing. Ben had always refused the comfort of heroic vows when reality would make them false. She used to call that emotional stinginess. Tonight it sounded more like integrity with bruises on it. A nurse came to recheck Ben's oxygen saturation and temp. Lydia stepped aside automatically, giving the clinician room, and found herself pressed near the edge of the cot, close enough to smell singed fabric and the sterile ointment beneath the smoke still caught in his skin. The familiarity of his physical presence struck her with embarrassing force. Not desire exactly, not nostalgia. Recognition at a cellular level. The body's old knowledge of someone it had once slept beside long enough to map. She hated that catastrophe reopened locked rooms inside her without permission. The nurse finished and scribbled numbers on a chart, clipped to the cot rail. You're holding, she told Ben. Not pretty, but holding. Been my brand lately. The nurse snorted once and moved on. Eli watched her go, then leaned back in his chair with his eyes closed. Lydia noticed the new fatigue settling over him, heavier now, his face thinned by treatment and the night both. How long until they move him somewhere real? She asked. The empty air more than anyone. Ben answered. If the ED clears space, maybe an hour, maybe 3. That's not somewhere real, Eli muttered without opening his eyes. That's hospital math. Lydia crouched beside him. You need rest. I need this night to be over. I can't give you that. I know. His eyelids fluttered open. Can I just not talk for a minute? Yes. She straightened. The tent seemed louder once he went quiet. Every cough and zipper and clipped order found her. On the far side, a deputy in dress uniform had an ice pack pressed to his temple while filling out a form with his free hand. A respiratory therapist stripped a wet sheet off a cot and replaced it with the speed of a stagehand between scenes. At the entrance, camera flashes flared intermittently through the canvas whenever the wind shifted a gap. The media were still out there, feeding on silhouettes and fragments. Lydia imagined how this would look if somebody got a lens into the tent. Sheriff injured in rescue. Cancer patient evacuated. Whistleblower email emerges. It would read like a prestige miniseries written by someone who had never had to smell burnt wiring on their own clothes. Ben seemed to follow some nearby line of her thought, because after a moment he said, They'll go after the board first, then admin, then me if they can use me to keep the commissioners clean. Lydia folded her arms. Can they? He gave a short breath that almost became a cough. Depends which version of the truth sells. I objected to the construction timeline. I didn't stop it. I flagged concerns about staffing during the expansion. I still stood on that stage when they cut the ribbon. The sentence sat between them. Lydia remembered the photo in the paper. Ben in uniform, county officials smiling, donors beaming, a blue ribbon pulled taut under fluorescent lights. She had hated the picture on sight, hated the pride in Eli's face when he clipped it for a school project, hated the whole machinery of public optimism that turned institutions into campaign backdrops. "Why did you go?" she asked quietly. Ben looked at her, and some old wariness crossed his face, the reflexive brace for judgment. She almost told him not to bother. Judgment had already happened, years of it, but she wanted the answer more than she wanted to win. "Because if I didn't show up," he said, "they'd say law enforcement had no concerns. And if I showed up, I could keep talking in rooms after the photographers left." Lydia's mouth tightened. "And did you?" "Yes." "Did it matter?" He looked away for the first time. That was answer enough until he added, "Not enough." The honesty of it made her angrier than evasion would have. Not because he lied, but because he had, in fact, been trying. Trying inside systems designed to sand human urgency into minutes and memos, until the original warning lost its heat. Trying while she stood outside those systems, and mistook partial failure for moral surrender. The distinction did not absolve him. It did not absolve anyone, but it complicated the clean, hard narrative she had been feeding herself ever since the marriage began to split. Eli stirred. "You're both doing that thing again." Lydia looked down. "What thing?" Thinking so loud it makes the air weird. Ben's mouth lifted at one corner despite the dressing. "Sorry." Eli opened his eyes fully now and studied his father's face. "Did it hurt?" Ben took a moment. "Yes." "A lot?" "Enough." "Did you get scared?" Lydia's heart gave an odd twist. Ben never lied to Eli when fear was the subject. It was one of the few mercies of his parenting. "Yes," Ben said. "When the ceiling panel came down in radiology, I thought I might not get back to the stairs." Eli swallowed. "But you still went in." "Yes." "Why?" The question sounded almost academic, but Lydia heard the raw layer under it. "Why are strangers worth the risk of losing you? Why is duty always competing with us? Why am I expected to admire the same instinct that leaves me waiting?" Ben exhaled carefully through the cannula. "Because when somebody is in front of you needing help, and you can help, the body moves before the philosophy does." Eli frowned. "That sounds like a bumper sticker for guilt." Lydia barked out a laugh before she could stop it. Ben closed his eyes briefly, conceding the point. "Fair. Then the honest answer is this. Because I'm not built well for standing still while other people are trapped. It makes me worse afterward." Eli considered him. "Worse for us too." There it was. Not accusation sharpened for effect, just the bill, presented cleanly. Ben received it the same way he would have received a wound check, jaw tight, no theatrics. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes worse for us too." Lydia looked away toward the tent wall because the intimacy of truth felt indecent in public. She thought of every fight that had begun with scheduling and ended with ontology. Not whether Ben loved them, but what his love did under pressure. Not whether she loved him, but whether love without primacy could ever feel safe to her. She had spent so long describing him as a man married to the county that she had stopped asking what it did to him to live split between callings that both insisted on urgency. And he, in return, had spent so long accepting blame for absences that he stopped telling her how often he came home ashamed and still failed to choose differently next time. The marriage had not died of one betrayal. It had died of unreconcilable measurements, administered daily until everything tender calcified into case law. Outside the tent, a sudden swell of voices rose above the rain. Not panic, crowd noise sharpened by something official. Seconds later, Nadia pushed through the entrance, rain on her shoulders, expression hard as cut stone. "State Fire Marshal is here," she said, to no one and everyone. "And the board chair just tried to ask me whether I was certain my maintenance email referred to that specific breaker and not a broader workflow concern." Lydia stared. "He said that tonight?" "He used the phrase workflow concern." Nadia's eyes flashed. "I briefly considered intubating him recreationally." Even Ben, injured and exhausted, let out a strained laugh that collapsed into coughing. Nadia stepped closer to his cot, her anger reassembling into precision. "They're starting formal witness sequestration for key personnel who had prior knowledge of facility complaints. That includes me, Facility Supervisor Tom Gentry, and likely you if you spoke to commissioners about expansion risk." Ben's face stilled. "I did. Documented? Text exchanges, meeting notes, maybe voicemail." Nadia nodded once. "Then tonight just became a legal organism." She turned to Lydia. "And, before you ask, yes, they'll eventually want family statements too, because Eli was a patient on the affected floor and you were physically present during evacuation." Eli slumped deeper in the chair. "I hate adults." "Get in line," Nadia said. Her gaze softened a fraction when it landed on him. "How's your breathing?" Still attached to capitalism and disappointment, Nadia set 2 fingers against his wrist to count pulse while hiding a smile. So baseline with mild improvement. Lydia watched them and felt a peculiar ache. Nadia moved through crisis with moral clarity and gallows humor and no visible need to be chosen by anyone. Lydia envied her, in the way exhausted people envied those who seemed coherent under fluorescent light. Ben said, "If they're sequestering statements tonight, Eli doesn't talk until he's medically cleared and represented." Nadia looked at him for half a second, measuring whether the father speaking was also the sheriff. "Agreed," she said. "And if anyone pressures him, I will become a paperwork emergency in human form." She moved off to confer with a marshal at the entrance. Lydia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Represented," she repeated quietly. "He's 11. He's also a witness in a probable negligence case involving a county hospital," Ben said, "which means certain people will hear innocence and think access." The fury in his voice was low but real. Lydia recognized it. Protective anger sat differently on him than public anger. Less performative, more lethal. She should have found that reassuring. Instead, it reopened an old wound. How often he could defend after the fact what he had failed to shield in advance. Then she hated herself for the thought, because he had just come out of a burning building. There was no humane time to litigate a marriage, and yet every time they stood near one another, the trial resumed of its own accord. Eli solved the tension by speaking into it. "If anybody asks me questions tonight, I'm just going to say the smoke smelled like lies and old wires." Ben rubbed a hand over his brow. "Please don't say that." "Why not? It's accurate." "Because accurate is not the same as useful in a recorded statement." "That sounds like politician language." "It's law enforcement language," Ben corrected, Lydia said. "Which is why he thinks it's politician language." Ben looked at her. For one suspended beat, they shared the same exhausted, almost smile. It vanished quickly, but it had existed, and that fact unsettled her more than hostility would have. She had built a life around the certainty that what was broken should remain legible as broken. Any flicker of ease threatened the architecture of survival she'd constructed since the separation. Yet standing here, with canvas walls breathing in and out with the wind, it was impossible not to remember that, before they became adversaries with a custody calendar, they had also once been allies in impossible rooms. She remembered Ben asleep upright in a NICU chair when Eli was an infant with RSV, his big hand hanging open beside the rails in case the baby reached. She remembered him teaching Eli to ride a bike in the church parking lot behind their first apartment, running bent over and breathless until both of them crashed, laughing into hydrangeas. Memory was treacherous that way. It arrived not to heal, but to complicate injury. A county council representative appeared at the tent entrance, umbrella folded, legal pad dry beneath a plastic sleeve. Ben saw him and muttered something under his breath. Lydia had not heard from him in front of their child in years. Eli's eyes widened with delighted fatigue. "Okay, that was a bad word." "Yes," Ben said. "It was." The council rep approached with apologetic urgency already arranged on his face. Lydia disliked him instantly, not because he had done anything yet, but because men who wore sympathy that carefully usually had somewhere else to place blame. "Sheriff Holloway, Dr. Shaw," he began. "I hate to intrude." Nadia, from 10 feet away, said, "And yet." He flinched, then pressed on. "The fire marshal and county commissioners need an initial closed-door factual sequence from anyone with prior notice of infrastructure concerns, strictly to coordinate response and avoid inconsistent public statements." Ben's entire body cooled. Lydia could see it happen. The injured husband and father receded. The office came forward. "If by factual sequence you mean rapid narrative containment before dawn coverage hardens," he said, "then no." Counsel tried a smile that drowned on contact. "With respect, Sheriff, we're trying to protect the county," Ben replied. "My son was on the affected floor." Counsel's eyes flicked toward Eli, recalibrating. "Of course, and I'm deeply sorry." "Don't," Lydia said. The word cracked, sharper than she intended. Everyone in earshot went still. She stepped closer, rainwater still drying in dark marks along the hem of her dress, one broken shoe making her stance uneven, and therefore somehow more dangerous. "Do not tell my child you're deeply sorry, while standing under county payroll trying to shape statements before the smoke is even out of the walls." Counsel opened his mouth, closed it. Ben did not stop her. That, more than anything, told her how bad it was. Usually he would have mediated, moderated, translated her rage into usable form. Tonight he let it stand there, raw and public. Counsel shifted tactics. "Mrs. Mercer, no one is shaping—" "That sentence is over," Lydia said. "You can come back with the fire marshal, independent counsel, and a time when my son is not in a chair under triage lighting." The man looked to Ben for override. Ben held his gaze. "You heard her." Counsel's face shuddered into the blank professionalism of a man marking down enemies for later. "Very well," he said, "but this will move quickly." Then try to keep up honestly, Nadia called from across the tent. He left. The wind pressed the canvas inward once, then let it go. Eli stared at his parents as if they had briefly transformed into a species he found both alarming and interesting. So, he said after a moment, we're definitely all getting sued by Sunrise, right? Lydia sank onto the stool beside Ben's cot because her legs suddenly felt hollow. Ben looked at Eli, then at Lydia, then back toward the tent entrance where officials still moved in silhouettes through rain and floodlight. Probably not by sunrise, he said, but by breakfast everyone will know what kind of day they're in. Probably not by breakfast. Everyone will know what kind of day they're in. The sentence settled over them with the dull inevitability of weather. Outside the tent, dawn was still hours away, but the night had already begun to thin into procedure. The first violent crisis had burned through itself. What remained was endurance, paperwork, monitoring, the long corridor between disaster and whatever shape accountability pretended to take. Lydia sat with her elbows on her knees and stared at the damp concrete visible under the cot legs. Water had tracked in from dozens of boots and wheels, leaving gray arcs and muddy crescents that overlapped into a map of other people's emergencies. Her own reflection showed faintly in one darker patch, blurred and unrecognizable. She wondered, not for the first time, whether collapse would feel different when it finally came, whether there would be a clean sensation of giving way, a visible edge. But every breakdown she had ever survived had arrived like this instead, dispersed across hours and obligations until there was no dramatic point of failure, only the awful realization that she had been carrying more than she could hold for too long and now had to keep carrying it anyway. A volunteer came through with foam cups of coffee and sealed juice boxes. Ben took coffee. Eli got apple juice. Lydia accepted a cup she did not want because refusing kindness in triage felt like superstition. The coffee smelled burnt and over-extracted and heavenly in the way terrible institutional coffee always did when the body had been driven hard enough. She held the cup between both hands and let the heat work into her fingers. Ben drank once, coughed, then looked irritated by his own lungs. "Don't take this personally," Lydia said, "but you really do look like hell. That's the sweetest thing you've said to me in months. Maybe years." Eli made a tired face. "Can you two please either get divorced harder or stop flirting weirdly?" Lydia nearly choked on coffee. Ben looked at his son, injured dignity and amusement fighting across his smoke-streaked features. That wasn't flirting. It wasn't normal divorced people behavior either. Eli took a slow sip of juice through the straw, then added, "You both sound more honest when one of you is bleeding." Lydia opened her mouth to protest and closed it again because the boy had become intolerably observant. The tent lights bleached everything into a false morning. Time inside had started to loosen from clocks. Nurses charted. Deputies rotated in and out with updates. Somewhere behind a canvas divider, a man was snoring through sedation while his wife fielded calls from relatives in a whisper that kept breaking on the same word. Stable. Lydia heard pieces of the world reassembling itself beyond the tent walls, reporters doing live shots, fire hoses draining, the low churn of county vehicles arriving with officials who had no practical use except to be seen taking control. Nadia passed by once with a tablet and a paper packet under one arm, stopped to examine Eli's chart, and frowned at his latest oxygen number. "Trending the right direction, but not fast enough for my taste," she said. "He stays observed through the morning at least. Maybe longer if the cough worsens." Eli sank an inch in the chair. "I was supposed to go home tomorrow." Nadia didn't soften. "Now you're supposed to keep your lungs functional. Adjust," he scowled, which seemed to reassure her more than compliance would have. She moved on toward a cluster of fire marshal staff in navy jackets. Lydia watched her speak with clipped exactness, one hand slicing the air at the phrase circuit load as if the syllables themselves had personally insulted her. "She's going to burn somebody alive with documentation," Lydia murmured. Ben followed her gaze. "Good." For a while, they said nothing. The quiet between them was not peaceful, but it was less armed than usual. Lydia found herself noticing details she would once have catalogued automatically in marriage, and now encountered with strange freshness. The faint tremor in Ben's right hand after exertion, something he usually hid by curling the fingers into his palm. The way he checked exits even while hurt, eyes moving not nervously, but methodically, never fully off-duty. The way exhaustion made his face younger at certain angles, stripping out the public mask and leaving behind the man who used to fall asleep on the couch halfway through bad cable dramas because he insisted he wasn't tired until he was already gone. She hated tenderness for being so badly timed. She hated how catastrophe could scrub away months of deliberate emotional distance in under an hour, leaving old attachments exposed and ridiculous. None of that changed what had broken them, but it made the edges harder to hold. Eli dozed in brief, shallow slips, waking every few minutes to cough or to ask whether the room had gotten colder. Lydia draped another blanket over his shoulders. His hair smelled faintly of smoke and hospital shampoo. When he slept, his face reverted, just enough, into younger versions of itself. 6 with a fever and cartoon bandages. 4 after a playground fall, furious more than injured. 2 against Ben's shoulder in the rocking chair at 3 in the morning. Memory arrived in fragments like dropped glass, each piece accurate and useless on its own. Ben watched her tuck the blanket in. He did good, he said quietly. Lydia kept her hands on the fabric a second longer than necessary. He did too much. Yes. Ben's agreement came without defensiveness, and something in that simplicity hurt. He shouldn't have had to tell us who we are in a hallway, Lydia said. No, he shouldn't know this much. Ben looked at his son's sleeping face. He knows this much because we made a child in the middle of 2 strong personalities and then taught him to read weather systems for survival. Lydia let out a bleak, unwilling laugh. That's one way to say it. It's the least flattering way, probably also the truest. He took another sip of coffee and set the cup down on the crate serving as a bedside table. I used to tell myself the separation was better for him because at least the conflict got scheduled. Lydia stared at him. You used to tell yourself that? You think you had the monopoly on coping narratives? He looked back at her, not hostile, just tired. I needed something to believe that wasn't failure. The tent seemed to tilt for a moment. Not physically, but morally, as if the floor under the story she had told herself shifted enough to show another structure beneath. She had assumed Ben experienced the separation as consequence, maybe regret, but also relief from domestic ambush. It had not fully occurred to her that he, too, had constructed small sentences to survive it. Better for him, better for Eli. Less shouting, more stability. Adults loved to call the least unbearable option healthy because children were listening. Lydia lowered herself onto the stool again. I told myself that too, she admitted. Ben's eyes flicked to hers. Did you? I told myself the apartment was calmer, that not waiting for you was easier than waiting for you, that if Eli only had to watch one adult be disappointed at a time, maybe that counted as progress. She stared at the coffee surface, trembling slightly in her hand. Sometimes it even felt true. Sometimes it was, Ben said. The kindness of that almost undid her. No argument, no tally of his own injuries, just an acknowledgement that partial truths still had truth in them. She wanted to ask him whether he had ever hated her for leaving first, though they had both been leaving for years before papers made it official. She wanted to ask whether he had stayed in the marriage as long as he did, out of love, or because quitting looked too much like moral failure to a man who built identity around endurance. She wanted, suddenly and uselessly, a clean courtroom question with a clean courtroom answer. Instead, she said, "You know they'll come for you." Ben gave the smallest shrug and immediately regretted it, pain flashing across his face. Probably. You went back in. Yes. That won't save you. I know. He looked toward the tent entrance, where the county council had vanished earlier. Heroism is only protective if the people above you need the public to believe in heroes, more than they need insulation from discovery. Depends on the week. And this week? This week they might prefer a reckless sheriff narrative to an ignored warning narrative. Lydia stared. They would actually do that. They don't have to do it explicitly. They just have to let the framing breathe. He shifted his burned jaw away from the pillow edge. Question my judgment for re-entering before a fire team cleared the corridor. Suggest I compromise chain of command. Turn me into a complicated actor in a chaotic scene, instead of a witness to prior concerns. You're saying this too calmly. I'm saying it from inside the machine. That was the part she could never beat. Ben understood systems not only ethically, but operationally. He knew where they bent, how they protected themselves, which phrases were knives in tailored clothing. Lydia had spent years resenting that fluency, hearing it as accommodation, when it was often the only language available to force truth into official rooms. Still, she knew the cost. Every time he translated human damage into admissible terms, some part of him came home less reachable, if he came home at all. A fire marshal stepped into the tent and spoke quietly with Nadia and 2 deputies. Ben watched without seeming to. They're moving to preliminary chronology, he said. Within the hour, maybe sooner. Lydia frowned. Can they do that while you're still under observation? They can ask. Whether I answer everything now is another matter. Eli's eyes opened without warning. Don't answer everything now. His voice was thick with sleep, but precise. Both parents turned toward him. He blinked, then coughed twice into the blanket. I know that was grown-up talk, but still, if bad people are trying to say less bad things, maybe don't help them while concussed. Ben's mouth twitched. That is unexpectedly solid legal guidance. Thank you. I'm forming opinions professionally now. Lydia smoothed the blanket at his shoulder. How much of that were you awake for? Enough to know no one should let county council near a microphone before sunrise. He squinted toward Ben. Also, if you pass out during a statement, that feels strategically bad. Ben looked at Lydia, who said, "He gets this from you." "No," Ben said. "The instinct to weaponize timing is pure Mercer." Eli closed his eyes again, perhaps satisfied that adult incompetence had been temporarily managed. The exchange left a fragile warmth in the air, a family resemblance of rhythm if not repair. Lydia felt it and mistrusted it. The worst nights sometimes created false treaties. Near loss could mimic reconciliation because survival made everyone temporarily honest and physically proximate. Then daylight arrived with logistics, lawyers, school forms, custody handoffs, and the ancient grievances returned wearing fresh clothes. She knew this. She still let herself rest one hand lightly on the edge of Ben's cot, as if to test whether the past had temperature. He noticed. His eyes dropped to her hand, then lifted back to her face. He did not comment. The restraint was worse than if he had. A volunteer social worker came by with intake sheets for affected families, and a careful voice trained for disaster zones. Lydia answered questions automatically. Address, emergency contacts, pre-existing conditions, temporary placement if hospital relocation became necessary. She almost said spouse at one prompt, then corrected herself to ex-husband so late the social worker looked up briefly, and then, to her credit, looked back down as if the correction were medically ordinary. Ben heard it. Of course he heard it. The words sat there between them afterward like a cooling instrument. Not because it was news, but because language made realities harder when spoken under fluorescent light. Ex-husband. Sheriff. Patient. Witness. Minor child on oncology treatment plan. Everyone becoming nouns suitable for forms. Once the social worker left, Ben said quietly, "Still sounds strange." Lydia knew exactly which word he meant. That's because bureaucratic terms are ugly. That's not the only reason. She did not answer. Outside, rain eased to a thinner patter. The air pressure in the tent seemed to change with it. People at the entrance shifted from crisis gate to morning after gate, shoulders lower, phones out, faces settling into the first fatigue of prolonged consequence. A deputy brought Ben a sealed evidence envelope containing his personal effects recovered from a locker near radiology. Wallet, keys, scorched phone. Ben looked at the phone like it had failed him morally. "Can that be salvaged?" Lydia asked. The deputy winced. "Maybe by people with dark powers." Ben set it aside. "Fine." Then, after the deputy moved off, he said, "My notes from the commissioner meeting might be in cloud backup, if the phone sync held before the battery died." Lydia looked at him sharply. "What notes?" "The expansion risk meeting from February. I wrote down who pushed for keeping temporary imaging live during pediatric overflow weeks." Her pulse kicked. "And?" Ben held her gaze. "And I wrote that Commissioner Vale asked whether the optics of delay would cost donor confidence." Lydia felt the sentence like a door unlocking into colder weather. Commissioner Vale, board chair's close ally, the man who had shaken Ben's hand at the ribbon cutting and kissed babies for campaign mailers. She remembered his wife telling her at a fundraiser that hospitals were really about trust branding now, not just care delivery. At the time, Lydia had smiled so hard her molars ached. "Do other people know you have that note?" she asked. "Possibly." "Does Vale?" "He knows what he said. Whether he knows I wrote it down is another question." Nadia reappeared as if summoned by the escalation itself. "Marshall wants a short sequencing interview with you in 30, she told Ben. "Not full deposition. Just scene chronology and prior notice scope. I told them you're concussed and they can either keep it tight or explain to a judge later why they interviewed an injured official beyond medical advice." Ben nodded. "Thank you." Nadia looked at Lydia. "There's also a pediatric transfer option opening at Mercy General by daybreak if this campus remains closed. Eli could stay there for observation and continue treatment without an interruption longer than 24 hours. Lydia's whole body responded before her mind did. Relief and dread at once. Another transfer. Another new room. Another disruption in a life already built around needles and calendars and contingency. Would he have to move by ambulance? She asked. Likely, Nadia said. Unless this site reopens a safe inpatient corridor, which I wouldn't bet on. Eli opened one eye. I hate being cargo. Nadia leaned down. You're not cargo. You're a medically high-maintenance adolescent with opinions. Same vibe. But he looked scared now. The joke thinner. Lydia brushed hair off his forehead. Another move meant more forms, more fear, more chances for the night to keep not ending. Ben watched the exchange and said, if he transfers, one of us rides with him. Nadia's expression made clear the practical problem before she voiced it. Given your status and likely statement schedule, that may need to be Lydia, Eli said. No. It came out sharper than anything he'd said in the last hour. Both parents looked at him. He swallowed, embarrassed by the force of it, but did not back off. No splitting up again tonight. Lydia felt the words hit old scar tissue. Ben's face went very still. Eli, he said carefully, if you transfer and I'm not cleared to go, that doesn't mean I know what it means. The boy's voice shook now from something deeper than fatigue. I know what everything means. That's the problem. I know there are reasons. I know there are jobs. I know there are procedures. I know you both tell the truth in pieces so nobody has to be the bad guy. I know all of it. He stopped to breathe, and the breath caught. Lydia was at his side in a second, hand on his back, waiting until the spasm passed. Tears had risen in his eyes without fully falling. I just don't want to wake up somewhere else and find out one of you stayed behind with a good reason. The tent around them did not go silent, but it seemed to pull back. Even Nadia, for one rare moment, had nothing clinical to offer. Lydia crouched until she was eye level with him. She wanted to promise the impossible, that nobody would stay behind again, that reasons would stop outranking bodies, that no institution would ever interpose itself between him and certainty another day of his life. But false promises had damaged this family almost as much as absences had. Ben spoke first, his voice lower than before. You won't wake up alone. Eli looked at him through wet lashes. That's not what I said. Ben took the hit and kept going. No, you said you don't want a good reason instead of a person. I heard you. He looked at Lydia then, and the room narrowed to the old familiar terror of trying to make a joint decision in public without reopening every historical wound. Something had to fracture. Statement or transfer, duty or bedside, evidence or child. The night was offering them the same test in a new costume. Lydia saw the calculation in Ben's face and understood with sick clarity that this, not the fire, might be the real beginning of whatever came next. Lydia saw the calculation in Ben's face and understood with sick clarity that this, not the fire, might be the real beginning of whatever came next. He looked older in that instant than he had on the courthouse steps the day they signed separation papers. Older than he had in the ICU when Eli first lost his hair, older even than tonight when smoke had blackened half his face, not because his body was failing, but because moral arithmetic always aged him faster than time did. Lydia knew the shape of his mind well enough to track the variables as they moved behind his eyes. If he delayed the Marshall interview, he risked letting the county set narrative around missing facts. If he pushed through the interview, concussed and half-treated, he handed hostile counsel an opening to call him impaired, unstable, reckless. If he stayed with Eli through transfer, he failed the window in which early statements carried most weight. If he chose the statement, he proved every fear his son had just named. The old rage in Lydia stirred, not at him exactly, but at the architecture that kept forcing his love into choices that resembled abandonment from the outside. Nadia, who had probably seen more marriages stripped down by fluorescent light than either of them could count, folded her arms and said, "There is no perfect answer, so everyone can stop waiting for one to descend from the tent ceiling." Eli stared at the blanket over his knees, breathing a little harder now that emotion had tightened his chest. Lydia kept a hand between his shoulder blades, counting the rise and fall through thin hospital cotton. Ben spoke without looking away from his son. What time would the transfer happen? Nadia glanced at her tablet. Earliest convoy out is 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours if Mercy's receiving team gets backed up. And the Marshall interview? 30 minutes, maybe 45 if they behave. Ben absorbed that. Could I do the interview now, then go with the transfer? Nadia's expression said what she was too disciplined to say aloud. Maybe if your symptoms don't worsen, if county council doesn't stall, if transport timing holds, if the world briefly stops being itself. Possible, she said. Not reliable. Lydia heard Eli's breathing change again, the edge of strain returning, and knelt lower. Hey, look at me. He did. His eyes were bright and furious, exactly like hers when cornered. You do not have to solve this for us, she said. I'm not solving it, he replied. I'm the one getting moved like luggage. The word luggage hit harder than cargo had, because luggage implied ownership without agency, something tagged and rerouted while other people argued at counters. Lydia swallowed. You're right. Eli blinked, startled by the immediate concession. I am? Yes, you are. And I'm sorry you had to say it that way for us to hear it. His face crumpled almost imperceptibly, not enough for full tears, just enough to show how tired he was of being articulate in emergencies. Ben leaned forward on the cot, ignoring whatever protest that pulled from his ribs or lungs. Then here's the part you get to decide, he said. Not everything. That wouldn't be fair. But this part, if the transfer happens, and I can't ride with you because the interview runs long, or I get pulled into medical hold, do you want your mother to go and get you settled, or do you want both of us to stay until transport leaves and risk a delay? Eli looked from one parent to the other. Lydia watched him recognize the offer for what it was. Not autonomy, not really, but dignity inside constraint. He hated constraint on sight, always had. Even as a toddler, he used to thrash against car seat straps with personal insult in his eyes. Now the fight had moved inward, into rooms and terms and bodies that made their own rules. He took a breath, then another through his nose, considering. If Mom goes and you're late, he said to Ben, will you actually come after? Ben's face changed, not softening exactly, but clearing. Yes. Not after press, not after meetings, not after important people need you to sound official. After the interview, if they clear me to leave, I come. And if they don't clear you? Ben paused. Lydia saw him resist the temptation to upgrade uncertainty into reassurance. Then I call you before you wake up. And I come as soon as they release me. No disappearing into logistics. Eli held his gaze. Say it normal. Ben took that in. Then, in the voice he used only for things too serious to decorate, he said, I will not make you look for me in the reasons. The tent seemed to tighten around the sentence. Lydia felt her own breath catch. Eli's eyes filled immediately, because children always knew when an adult had finally located the true language. He nodded once, hard, like a bargain being accepted under duress. Okay, he whispered. Lydia bent and kissed the top of his head before she could stop herself. His hair was still faintly damp from smoke and rain. Ben looked away for a second, and she knew why. Some tendernesses were easier to survive indirectly. Nadia tapped her tablet against her thigh. Good. That's the family plan. Now the universe will ignore it, but at least we have one. She looked at Ben. I want neurochecks before and after you speak to the marshal. Any slurred speech, worsening headache, or altered recall. And I end the interview myself. You're very controlling, Ben said. That's why I get things done. She moved off again to coordinate transport. Lydia stood slowly, every joint in her body reminding her that adrenaline had borrowed against tomorrow. She had not once thought about her apartment, her phone charger, the dress she was still wearing under a borrowed blanket, the fact that everything after this would require practical steps she had not planned. The future beyond sunrise felt both imminent and abstract, like paperwork glimpsed through fog. Ben rubbed his temples with 2 fingers. I need to ask you something before the marshal gets here. Lydia crossed her arms instinctively, as if bracing against impact. That sounds ominous. Probably is. He glanced at Eli, who had closed his eyes, but was unmistakably listening. If I mention the February meeting notes and Vale's comment, this stops being just facilities negligence. It becomes political exposure. They'll dig into commissioner pressure, donor influence, procurement shortcuts, all of it. If I don't mention it now, and they find the notes later, it looks like concealment. Lydia answered, without hesitation. Then you mention it. Ben studied her. You know what that does? Yes. It will get ugly. It is already ugly. He held her gaze a beat longer. For Eli, too. That slowed her, because there it was, the real cost hidden under civic language. Media outside the school. Parents whispering at oncology fundraisers. Their son's illness braided publicly into a county scandal. Every private wound turned discoverable by subpoena and public interest. Lydia hated that the argument had teeth. If you don't say it, she replied, more quietly now. They use your silence to protect themselves. If you do say it, they may use the truth to hurt us. Those are not equal options. They're just both cruel. Ben looked down at his burned hand resting on the blanket. I know. Eli opened his eyes. Say it. Both parents turned. He was pale with fatigue, voice small but clear. If grown-ups get to use me in the story either way, at least make it the real story. Lydia's throat tightened so fast it hurt. Ben stared at his son for a long second, then nodded once, almost formally, like assent in court. Okay. A fire marshal in a Navy windbreaker entered the tent with a recorder, a legal pad, and the expression of a man who preferred combustion physics to human compromise. Beside him trailed county counsel again, dry now, face composed into neutral attentiveness. Lydia felt hatred rise on sight, hot and clean enough to be almost invigorating. Nadia intercepted them first, set conditions, documented medical constraints, and extracted promises about duration and scope in language, so controlled it sounded almost elegant. Then she gave Ben a penlight neurocheck, had him repeat 3 words, name the month backward, track her finger. He passed with irritation, which she seemed to take as a positive sign. The interview happened in the same tent but behind a pulled canvas partition that granted privacy only acoustically, not visually. Lydia stayed with Eli on the other side, hearing cadence without content, the low even rhythm of Ben's official voice punctuated by the marshal's shorter questions. She did not try to catch words. She knew enough about statements to understand that partial hearing only bred panic. Instead, she watched Eli. At some point during the second question, he reached blindly for her hand without opening his eyes. She gave it to him. His fingers were cool and dry now, less tremor than before. Good sign. Small mercies. Around them, the tent was shifting toward morning logistics. New staff relieving night staff. Fresh carts rolled in. Someone distributed printed maps of temporary patient redirection sites. The rain outside had thinned to a mist, and through a gap near the entrance, Lydia could see the hospital facade under floodlights, smoke now reduced to occasional ugly breaths from the upper floor. Firefighters moved slower. Reporters moved faster. Dawn was beginning to color the low cloud cover a dirty blue-gray. The whole scene looked less cinematic in that light and more municipal, which was somehow worse. Disasters at night still allowed illusion. By morning, everything belonged to budgets and statements and evidence bags. The interview behind the partition stretched beyond Nadia's promised 45 minutes. Lydia saw her check the clock twice, jaw tightening. On minute 50, she strode over and yanked the partition back without ceremony. Ben was sitting up straighter than he had any right to, eyes shadowed with pain. County counsel leaning in as if proximity could turn exhaustion into concession. Nadia cut through the air like a blade. Done, counsel began. Doctor, we are in the middle of… No, she said. You were in the middle of extending a medically limited timeline because men in windbreakers assume concussions to respect hierarchy. The marshal, to his credit, looked chastened rather than offended. Ben closed his eyes once, as if the permission to stop had reached his nervous system all at once. Lydia caught a glimpse of the recorder on the crate beside him, red light still blinking. For a wild second she wanted to smash it with her heel. Counsel gathered his papers with controlled displeasure. There may need to be follow-up. Ben opened his eyes and said, very calmly, there will, with representation and a full transcript request. Counsel's mouth flattened. Good, Lydia thought with savage satisfaction. Bleed. The marshal gave Ben a curt nod that carried, if not warmth, at least respect. For what it's worth, Sheriff, your chronology aligns with the physical evidence we have so far, Ben answered. For what it's worth, make sure the evidence gets to outrank the commissioners. The marshal's expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. That's the job. When they left, Nadia performed another neurocheck and pronounced Ben more irritated, but not more confused. A slim margin, she said. Don't squander it. Eli had sat up during the end of the interview. Did you tell them? He asked. Ben looked wrecked now, the cost of clarity written along his posture. Yes. All of it? Enough to make hiding the rest harder. Eli leaned back, absorbing. Lydia saw the fear in him, but also a strange, fragile pride he was trying not to show. Not pride in scandal, pride in being answered honestly. Ben reached for his coffee cup, discovered it empty, and looked briefly betrayed by reality itself. Lydia took the cup, rose, and went to the volunteer station for a refill before she had fully decided to. On the way back, she realized the gesture mattered more than the coffee. Care was always made of ridiculous logistics in the middle of catastrophe. Cups, blankets, chargers. Who held the bag when someone vomited? Who remembered to ask when the last pain medication was given? She returned and handed Ben the fresh cup. Their fingers touched, warm on warm for less than a second. Still, he looked up at her with such unguarded surprise that she nearly withdrew the cup again out of self-protection. Thanks, he said. Don't make it meaningful, she replied too quickly. Impossible request. Eli, eyes half closed, muttered, please never stop talking like divorced spies. Lydia sat again, more heavily this time. The transfer coordinator arrived just after first light with paperwork and a transport ETA of 22 minutes. Mercy General had accepted Eli's oncology continuation. One parent rider only due to vehicle staffing. Ben was still not cleared for discharge from observation. Lydia felt the night narrow into sequence. Sign here. Confirm medication list. Verify allergies. Authorize record transfer. She signed everything with a hand that looked steadier than she felt. Ben listened to each instruction with the contained frustration of a man kept horizontal by medical necessity, while his family was being reorganized around him. When the coordinator left, he said, My deputy can escort you there and stay outside if media follows. Lydia nodded. Good. I'll call Morales. Good. So many years together, and that was what care sounded like now. Not sentiment, but infrastructure. Yet beneath the practical exchange lay something rawer. Neither of them wanted this split. Not this morning. Not after Eli had asked not to be left behind with a reason. But the choice had already been made by lungs, protocols, and timing. No clean solution. The old rule held. Saving one thing fractured another. Eli seemed to understand that too. When the transport team wheeled in a narrower medical chair and portable oxygen, he looked at it with naked disgust. "I hate every version of this furniture," he said. Lydia helped adjust his blanket. "Reasonable." Ben swung his legs over the side of the cot before anyone could stop him. He stood too fast, swayed once, caught himself on the rail, and ignored Nadia's profanity. Lydia moved toward him on instinct, then checked herself. He steadied, crossed the 2 steps to Eli. Knelt with visible effort, despite protest from ribs or burns or both. Eye level again. Always eye level when it mattered. "Listen to me," he said. Eli tried for sarcasm and failed. "That never goes great." Ben's mouth twitched. Then he took his son's hand, dirty nails, IV tape, everything. "You go with Mom. You let them monitor you. You answer no questions from anyone not wearing a clinical badge unless your mother says yes. You keep your phone on if it charges. I call when transport leaves. I call when you arrive. If they keep me here, I still call. If they release me, I come. No vanishing into reasons." Eli looked wrecked by wanting to believe him. "Okay." Ben nodded once, then surprised Lydia by turning to her with no buffer of irony. "I need a favor." She braced. "What?" "If Vale or Council or anyone from County reaches out to you before I do, don't answer alone." She stared. "You think they'd contact me directly? You were on the floor. You're articulate. And if they think I've become uncooperative, they may look for softer access points." Lydia almost laughed at softer. "That would be a strategic misread." "Yes," Ben said, "but not one I want tested while you're sleep-deprived and transporting our son." The hour in that sentence landed quietly, almost invisibly, and therefore harder. She nodded. "Fine." He held her eyes 1 beat longer. "Thank you." So much history in 2 normal words. She wanted to say something equal in weight, and not equal in vulnerability. What came out instead was, "Don't let them make you the fire." Ben understood immediately. She saw it in the way his expression changed, not outwardly much, just enough to show the sentence had reached the exact bruise. "I won't help them," he said. "That's not the same as stopping them." "I know." She did. And that was the terror. The transport team moved in. Nadia signed the final medical packet. Morales arrived at the tent entrance, hat under his arm, face solemn with the overcareful gentleness officers used around sick children and their parents. Eli was transferred from one chair to the other with awkward straps and apologies. He hissed once through his teeth when the movement jarred his chest. Lydia held the oxygen line clear and murmured useless soothing things because there was nothing practical left to do in that moment except be a voice. When he was settled, he looked between his parents with a kind of exhausted authority that belonged to neither age nor illness alone, but to repetition. "Don't do the thing where you talk around stuff because you think it protects me," he said. "It doesn't. It just makes me work harder." Lydia felt every adult failure of the last several years light up at once. Ben nodded first. "Okay." Lydia followed. "Okay." Eli considered them as if evaluating witness credibility, then accepted the terms provisionally. The transport team started rolling him toward the entrance. Ben stood 1 step back, jaw clenched against whatever standing cost him. Lydia walked beside the chair until the threshold, then stopped and turned back. Tent light behind him, gray dawn beyond her. Ben looked like a man caught between arenas, neither domestic nor public, both claiming him. For a second, no one else existed. Not deputies, not medics, not the county waiting outside with forms sharpened into knives. Just the unbearable fact of a shared child being moved again through a world that kept requiring proof. Lydia went back 2 steps, rose onto her broken heel without caring that it hurt, and kissed Ben's soot-cleaned cheek just beside the bandage. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement of mortality and witness and the indecency of maybe losing someone before all the important sentences were spoken. When she pulled back, both of them looked equally startled, which almost made it easier. Almost. "Come when you can," she said. Ben's eyes held hers. "I will." Then Lydia turned, took hold of Eli's chair, and followed the transport team into the cold blue morning as the hospital behind them steamed, and the county ahead of them prepared to decide what version of the truth it could afford. Then Lydia turned, took hold of Eli's chair, and followed the transport team into the cold blue morning as the hospital behind them steamed, and the county ahead of them prepared to decide what version of the truth it could afford. Dawn had fully broken by the time they reached the ambulance bay assigned for interfacility transfer, though the light did nothing kind for the world. It flattened everything. The floodlit drama of the night gave way to municipal gray, wet asphalt, exhausted responders, coffee cups crushed under boots, yellow tape sagging with rainwater, smoke stains darkening the upper hospital facade like bruises. The air smelled of diesel, wet concrete, and the ghost of burnt plastic still drifting from somewhere deep inside the building. Lydia walked beside Eli's chair with one hand on the handle and the other steadying the portable oxygen tank hanging from the side. Morales moved ahead, clearing a narrow path through staff and equipment with quiet authority. Behind them, through the open seam of the treatment tent, Lydia caught one last glimpse of Ben standing where she had left him, one hand braced on the cot rail, shoulders squared out of sheer stubbornness. Then canvas shifted, bodies crossed, and he was gone from sight. It should have felt familiar by now, the abrupt loss of visual contact with him. Their whole marriage had become a study in that sensation. Still, this time it landed differently. Not abandonment, not exactly. More like being forced to trust a bridge she had spent years describing as structurally unsound, because now her son had already begun crossing it. The transport medic introduced herself as Erin, maybe 30, freckles under tired eyes, voice brisk in the way people in emergency medicine learn to make briskness sound humane. She helped lock Eli's chair in place beside the open ambulance and ran through the transfer checklist with Lydia, while a second medic secured monitors inside. Mercy's oncology floor has the handoff packet, Erin said. His port status is documented, current meds included, respiratory note flagged for reassessment on arrival. Ride should be about 22 minutes, barring traffic or road closure. Eli looked up at her from under the blanket. Can I skip the part where everyone says barring traffic, like traffic, is the most likely problem tonight? Erin gave him a quick sideways smile. You're going to fit right in. At Mercy, half their peds floor speaks fluent sarcasm. That's encouraging in a bleak way. Lydia signed one last form on the medic's clipboard, her name coming out jagged from lack of sleep and too much adrenaline withdrawal. Morales stepped closer. I'll follow behind, he told her. No lights unless we need them. If media cars latch on, I'll peel them off before Mercy intake. Thank you, Lydia said. He nodded once, but his eyes carried the extra message. For him too. For Ben. For the version of loyalty that existed outside blood and paperwork, built instead from long shifts and witnessed character. Lydia appreciated it more than she could say. The ambulance interior was too bright, too clean, too narrow. As soon as the doors shut, the outside world vanished into insulated hum and instrument beeps. Eli was strapped onto the stretcher rather than left in the chair, which made him look suddenly smaller and more contained than he had under the disaster tent. The blanket rode too high under his chin. Lydia sat on the bench beside him and clipped her seatbelt with stiff fingers, while Erin checked oxygen flow and pulse ox. When the ambulance pulled away, the motion was gentler than Lydia expected. Not dramatic, just a low forward roll through wet streets beginning to admit morning traffic. Through the back windows, she saw the hospital recede, its upper floors still ringed with emergency vehicles and temporary fencing. For a second, it looked unreal, like a damaged set being struck after filming. Then a city bus passed between them, and the view broke apart. Eli watched the ceiling for a while. His face had gone waxy with fatigue again. Lydia knew the signs. The body's last decent hour giving way to the crash. She tucked the blanket closer along his shoulder and said, "You can sleep." He turned his head toward her. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because if I sleep now, I wake up in another room and my brain takes a few seconds to remember the right disaster." The sentence was so quiet she almost missed it. She leaned back against the metal wall and looked at him properly. "You really do think all the way through things," she said. "That's not a compliment." "No," Lydia admitted. "Not this morning." Erin kept her eyes tactfully on the monitor, but Lydia could feel the respectful non-hearing practiced by medical staff around families in transit. Outside, the city slid by in smeared gray strips. Chain drugstores, a diner opening its lights, a school crossing sign gleaming wet, a campaign billboard with Commissioner Vale's smile already starting to peel at one corner from weather. Lydia stared at that billboard until it disappeared. The man's face felt obscene in daylight. Eli noticed where she had been looking. "That him?" "Yes. He looks like a guy who says community a lot while ruining things." Lydia let out a tired breath that almost became a laugh. "That is alarmingly precise. It's the teeth." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Do you think Dad's going to be okay?" There it was, the real question under all the others. Lydia did not answer immediately. She watched his fingers worrying the edge of the blanket, a small, repetitive motion he'd had since infancy when overstimulated. She remembered holding those same fingers flat to count them after birth, because she had been absurdly relieved by ordinary anatomy. 10 fingers, 10 toes, one whole impossible child. No one tells you that after that first inventory, the counting never ends. Blood counts, fever numbers, minutes late, missed calls, breaths between coughing, ways someone can fail and still remain essential. Physically? She said. Probably. He inhaled smoke and got knocked around, but he was talking, tracking, arguing. Those are all strong signs with him. Eli considered that. And not physically? Lydia looked down at her own hands. There were faint black smudges still caught along the cuticles, smoke in the places soap missed. I don't know, she said. I think this is going to cost him. Because he told them? Because he told them. Because he knows where some of the pressure came from. Because people with expensive problems don't like witnesses who survive long enough to stay specific. Eli absorbed that with a grimness no 11-year-old should wear. Will they fire him? Maybe not right away. People like process too much for that. But they may isolate him. Question judgment. Leak selective things. Make him spend energy proving he isn't the story. Eli was quiet for several beats. The ambulance turned, tires hissing on wet pavement. He hates when bad people get to look calm, he said finally. Lydia turned toward him. That's true? So do you? Also true? He sighed, then winced at the pull in his chest. Aaron looked over, checked the monitor, adjusted his oxygen by a notch, and went back to charting. Lydia lowered her voice. Rest. You too. One of us has to pretend to be the adult. That hasn't gone great historically. The timing of the line was so perfect, so mercilessly observant, that Lydia laughed whether she wanted to or not. The laugh came out cracked and tired and too loud in the small ambulance, but it cleared something in her chest for a second. Eli smiled without much strength. There, he said. You sound less haunted. I am haunted. Yeah, but now you're haunted with circulation. Mercy General's receiving entrance was quieter than St. Catherine's had ever been, even in crisis. Different part of the city. Older brick exterior. Narrower ambulance canopy. The emergency activity here was ordinary rather than catastrophic, which made Lydia irrationally grateful. She wanted fluorescent boredom. She wanted routine over spectacle. As the ambulance backed in, her phone vibrated in the clutch bag she had almost forgotten she was still carrying. She fumbled it out. Ben. No text, just a single message. Leaving tent now. CT clear. Delayed on admin hold. Coming as soon as discharge signed. Tell him I kept the promise in order. Lydia stared at the screen long enough that Aaron had to ask if everything was okay. Yes, she said, though the word came out thin. She turned the phone toward Eli. His eyes moved over the message twice, not because he didn't understand, but because relief took time to enter a tired body. He nodded once and shut his eyes. Good, he whispered. Intake at Mercy was a blur of clean forms and new faces who had been briefed just enough to be efficient, not enough to be emotionally intrusive. Lydia appreciated that. The oncology charge nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Carla with silver braids and reading glasses on a chain, reviewed Eli's transfer notes without once speaking to him in the falsely bright voice hospital staff, sometimes used when they mistook illness for fragility. Okay, she said, scanning the pages. You had a terrible night. Your oxygen annoys me. And everybody at your previous hospital seems to have been making criminally stupid choices. We'll handle the first two and leave the third to lawyers for at least the next hour. Eli looked at her with immediate cautious respect. You're kind of scary. That is because I am excellent. She pointed Lydia toward a private room at the end of the pediatric oncology hall, the kind reserved for immunocompromised patients. By the time Eli was settled into the new bed, attached to wall oxygen, and grudgingly cooperative with fresh vitals, the morning had sharpened into full day. Rain tapped softly against the sealed window. The room smelled like bleach, plastic tubing, and the faint vanilla note of industrial hand soap. Compared to the chaos of the night, its stillness felt almost suspicious. Lydia stood by the window while Carla adjusted the monitor settings and reviewed meds with a resident. Below, the hospital parking deck glistened. A television in the room next door murmured daytime news. Somewhere in the hall, a child was crying with the repetitive stamina of the overtired. Everything ordinary. Everything carrying on as if buildings had not burned and marriages had not reopened and counties had not begun cannibalizing their own witnesses before breakfast. When Carla and the resident left, Eli drifted at last into real sleep. Not the defensive half-dozing of the tent or ambulance, but the deeper surrender of a body that had run out of reasons to stay awake. Lydia sat in the chair beside his bed and let herself stop moving for the first time since the fundraiser. The stillness was almost violent. Her body cataloged injuries she had been too busy to notice. The raw scrape on her shoulder from the stairwell door, the ache in her wrist from catching the sled, the blister on the heel of her unbroken shoe, the fine, deep tremor running through her thighs. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, and covered her face with both hands. No tears came at first, just heat. Then, a slow, involuntary shaking that had nothing theatrical in it. She stayed like that until her phone buzzed again. Not Ben this time. An unknown number. She stared at it, pulse kicking. Then another buzz, this one from Nadia. Do not answer unknowns yet. Fire Marshal requests formal statement this afternoon. Counsel already circling. Drink water before becoming a flamethrower. Lydia actually smiled. The smile vanished when the unknown number left a voicemail, and a second message arrived from a local reporter whose name she recognized from the hospital parking lot. She locked the screen without opening either. A knock sounded softly at the door. Morales stepped in, hat in hand. He asked me to stay until he arrived, he said. Lydia nodded, too tired to offer normal hospitality. Any updates? Local stations are running with the maintenance email. Not the commissioner angle yet. He hesitated. Sheriff left St. Catharines 15 minutes ago, but county admin tried to stop him on the way out for a press staging plan. Lydia looked up sharply. And? Morales's mouth shifted in what might have been the beginning of a grin. He told them if they put him in front of cameras before he saw his son, they could explain that decision under oath. Good, Lydia thought again, with the same savage relief as before. Good. Will that help him? She asked. Morales took his time answering. Depends what you mean by help. It won't make him easier to manage. That, Lydia thought, might be the nearest thing to protection available. Morales stationed himself in the hall, while Lydia forced herself to use the room bathroom, wash smoke out of her hands a second time, drink water from the paper cup by the sink, and text her sister a minimal update she would regret if family heard through the news first. When she came back out, Eli was still asleep, mouth slightly open, lashes dark against his too pale skin. She sat again, waited. The room clock moved with irritating confidence. 11 minutes, 23, 31. At some point, Carla returned with scrubs and a clear bag donated from hospital inventory, because Lydia was still in a smoke-scented cocktail dress that now felt like evidence from another person's life. Lydia changed in the bathroom and folded the dress into the plastic bag with a care that surprised her. Maybe because discarding it felt premature. Maybe because part of her already understood that objects from nights like this become archives, whether you want them to or not. It was just after 10 when Ben appeared in the doorway. He looked worse in daylight, which somehow reassured Lydia. Smoke and injury belonged less convincingly to the realm of nightmare when the sun was up and still found you bruised. He had changed into wrinkled hospital scrubs and borrowed sneakers. The bandage along his jaw stood out stark against freshly cleaned skin. His eyes found Eli first, automatically, and stayed there until he had crossed the room and placed 2 fingers lightly against the boy's ankle over the blanket, as if confirming by touch what sight had already told him. Only then did he look at Lydia. No smile, no performance. Just a raw, visible exhale, the body's version of "thank God" arriving after language. You came, she said, and immediately hated how much the sentence revealed. Ben seemed to hear the same thing. I said I would. He pulled the visitor chair closer to the bed and lowered himself into it with enough carefulness to suggest new pain medication or old stubbornness, probably both. For a while, neither adult spoke. Eli slept between them, oxygen hissing softly. Rain ticked against the window in an almost domestic rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a call bell chimed and was answered. The ordinariness of the room made everything else feel less survivable, not more. In a disaster tent, intimacy could hide inside crisis. Here, with white walls and a hand sanitizer dispenser and a tray table holding unopened crackers, there was nowhere for history to stand except directly between them. Ben broke first. Vale's office put out a statement about tragic, unforeseen circumstances. Lydia let out one short, humorless laugh. Of course he did. County admin is calling the email an early operational concern, not yet connected to root cause. Which means connected enough to scare them. Ben nodded once. The marshal didn't like that wording. Good. He glanced at her, then toward Eli. I requested independent outside review formally before I left. Lydia stared. You can do that? I can request it publicly enough inside the right rooms that denying it gets expensive. And did you? Not yet, but I made it hard to pretend the ask wasn't made. She sat back slowly. This was the part of Ben she had always both depended on and resented. The precise understanding of how to insert truth into systems that preferred softer versions of themselves. So what happens now? She asked. He answered without dressing it up. Now the county tries to protect itself. The board tries to protect donors. The commissioners try to protect re-election. The hospital staff try to protect patients and jobs at the same time. The press tries to turn sequence into story before noon, and we try to keep Eli out of the blast radius, while still telling the truth when it matters. The we, in that sentence, did not sound accidental. Lydia looked at him across their sleeping son and realized with a fatigue so deep it bordered on clarity that there would be no clean reset after this. Not romantic restoration, not neat vindication, not a courtroom-quality ending where the guilty were named and the good were compensated and the family rediscovered itself through shared ordeal. Real life was meaner and more procedural, but something had shifted that could not be shifted back. Not because the fire had purified anyone. Fires never did. They only burned away some of the lies people could still afford. She said, "You know, if we do this together for him, people will misunderstand it." Ben's gaze stayed on Eli. "People misunderstand everything worth doing." "That is an incredibly annoying answer." "I'm injured." "It's the best you get." That pulled a real laugh from her this time. Small but clean. It woke Eli. He blinked once, then twice, eyes moving from Lydia to Ben and back, orienting. When he saw both of them, there in daylight, still in the room, still real, something in his face loosened that Lydia had not realized had been clenched all night. He looked suddenly young, not because the intelligence left him, because fear did, briefly. "Okay," he murmured, already sliding back toward sleep. "That's better." Neither parent answered right away. There was nothing to add that would improve on the simple verdict of a child who had been made to manage too much. Ben rested one forearm on the bed rail. Lydia leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape but to remain inside the fact of the room without overspeaking it. Outside, the city continued into noon. Cameras, statements, lawyers, blame. Inside, under hospital light, gentler than the night before, a broken family held still long enough to resemble shelter. And though Lydia knew it would not stay simple, knew the investigations would cut, and the old grievances would return with sharper tools, she also knew that some truths, once finally spoken in the right voice, did not let the old arrangements survive them. The fire would travel outward, through institutions for months. The marriage might never become a marriage again. The county would almost certainly try to make heroes, fools, and liabilities out of the wrong people in the wrong order. None of that changed the quiet, inconvenient fact that when the boy in the bed had asked not to be left alone with reasons, both of them had heard him at last. And for now, in a room that smelled of rain and antiseptic and the scorched edge of a life interrupted, hearing him would have to be the beginning.